Okay, welcome to Who Wrote Shakespeare. We will talk, if not directly about who wrote Shakespeare, we will be talking about Tudor-era plays. Like to introduce our panelists. First of all, and I think this is the first time I get to say this in a public forum, this, to my right is Brian Clack, who is now officially the A. Vasiliadis Distinguished Director of the Humanities Center, and Professor of Philosophy. And to my left, Jordan Matuszewski, who is a Keck Undergraduate Humanities Research Fellow and a second-year USD student in computer science. I will also mention, because she's on the program, although she's not here, Maura Giles-Watson, who is an associate professor of English. She's on sabbatical this year. She is also the director of the Tudor Plays Project. And my name is Paul Evans. I'm the Digital Humanities Fellow here in the Humanities Center. We're going to start with Brian, because Brian is at the beginning of our project, and this gives you an idea of the life cycle of how one of these analyses even comes into being in the first place.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, this is interesting how this has come about. My digital humanities credentials are very easy to summarize. They're at 0. I have a lot of Paul's work in the center here consists of me running in and saying, I don't know how to do track changes on a document, or why is Google Mail looking different this morning? And that's something which takes me about 3 months to get used to. So I really am not any kind of candidate for anything technological or digital. But out of research that I'm undertaking at the moment, a problem has arisen, or a problem came to my attention, which I spoke with Paul about, and it seems that this is precisely the sort of problem that could be resolved using the techniques within the DH field of author attribution. So I'm going to just say, and I'm going to take long on this because, as Paul said, I'm really at the very beginning of this. We don't know how this is going to go, where it's going to go to, but it gives you an idea of the kind of thing that possibly this can help. The research I'm working on at the moment is putting together an edition of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is one of the great texts of political philosophy and 18th century British philosophy. In doing this research, I'm obviously reading, as we do obsessively, everything on or by this particular figure. Now, his work on the French Revolution falls within the later part of his period, when he was already a very established and well-known figure. He was a British statesman, an Irishman, of course, but a member of the British Parliament, and well-known. But his earlier work is much more mysterious. There were 2 books that he published in the 1750s, Vindication of Natural Society, which was written as a kind of pastiche of in the style of Henry VII, Viscount Bolingbroke, God bless him, and then the great book on the Sublime and the Beautiful, again published anonymously. There's also a mass of early poems, articles, essays, juvenilia. We know that some of these pieces are by Burke, even though they weren't published under his name. Other things are far less settled. And among these are a set of articles written variously by a group of 3 people, including Burke, published in a little paper called The Reformer, published in 1748, while he was still at the end of his student days in Dublin. So in a sense, it's a bit like the Vista, I suppose. A very kind of intense student paper. And the writers appear to have been Burke, someone else called Beaumont Brennan, and then William Dennis. And the stated purpose of this paper, The Reformer, was, and I quote, to expose dullness in the theatre land of Dublin. And I think exposing dullness is a very good student project. And also the purpose is, I quote, to establish a spirit of benevolence, good sense, and religion in this city. So the Reformer is this 4-page paper appearing weekly, would contain an essay, sometimes a poem, some advertisements, most of which seem to have been entirely made up. So it's this sort of almost sort of postmodernist kind of undertaking. But what's pertinent for today's session is this: as the editors of the latest edition of Burke's writings, so it's this big sort of 10-volume edition of Burke's complete works, just finally finished after 250 years. The editors say Burke was the editor of the Reformer and probably contributed most of the material, though attribution of particular pieces remains uncertain. Right? This is the problem. Attribution of certain pieces remains uncertain. Now, this judgment of uncertainty is also found in F.P. Locke's definitive biography of Burke, which was published in 1998. Locke tells us that each article in the Reformer was just signed by an initial, B, and that could have been Burke, of course, but it might also have been Beaumont Brennan. That little sign A fused with E, which I believe is pronounced I or E. How do you pronounce that?
I in Latin, classical Latin.
There you go. I in classical Latin. Or U. On one occasion, S, which seems to be another person, and other times just unsigned. Locke says their subject matter is diverse, and he follows this up with this footnote. So here we are. It's footnote 88. He says, this hampers stylometric analysis, for few variables are sufficiently independent of content to permit valid testing of such short texts on different topics. For example, B has a strikingly higher rate than I or U of first-person pronouns and adjectives. But much of the discrepancy is accounted for by number 5, the Reformer's first-person account of his search, what people thought about the paper. Another problem is the paucity of material. The total length of the Reformer papers is about 17,000 words. Individual essays are under 2,000 words. Some of the essays may be joint productions. Most seriously, no suitable control samples are available for any of the 3 members of the triumvirate, Burke, Brennan, Dennis. While they do not preclude stylometric analysis, these considerations greatly reduce the persuasive value of the results obtained. And that's about as far as I've got with this. Now, I will say this. If anyone could definitively, or even with high probability, say which of these pieces were written by Burke himself, that would mark a very significant contribution to Burke scholarship. So it's a puzzle which has exercised his biographers. And with that, over to Paul.
Okay. Let's go from an example in the 18th century to an example 3 weeks ago. Most of you have heard of the anonymous op-ed that appeared in the New York Times on September 5th, in which somebody claiming to be an official in the Trump administration talked about steps that various people inside the administration were taking to, I guess, rein in Trump, if you want to use that phrase. This has set off a fevered speculation, both not least by Trump himself, as to who this person is, but it has also produced several attempts at attribution that claim to be, I'll say, somewhat scholarly. In Slate, on September 7th, William Salatin claimed to identify Anonymous as John Huntsman, a U.S. ambassador to Russia and former governor of Utah, based on the phrase country first, the use of malign as an adjective rather than as a transitive verb, mooring, impetuous, and inclination. Salatin is a political journalist and not necessarily doing anything more than any of the rest of us would do, just noticing unusual words that catch the eye. A more rigorous version of this kind of analysis can be used to statistically identify most distinctive words in a set of text samples, but most distinctive word analysis is not typically used for the purpose of authorship attribution. It might be a good way to get at differences in content between two pieces, but it's not a terribly good way to attribute authorship. In Ceylon on September 20th, Don Foster identified Jim Mattis, current Secretary of Defense, as anonymous based on the phrases malign behavior, not just the word malign, but the two-word phrase, shared values, first principle, tribalism trap, and two-track presidency. Foster is a little stronger in the Department of Academic Credentials. He was a professor at Vassar, now retired. And his academic claim to fame was that he attributed the 1612 poem, A Funeral Elegy for Master William Peter, to Shakespeare. Now, this is an attribution that I'll say held up for about a decade, but ultimately others, I would say the consensus of Shakespearean scholarship has now rejected that attribution. In the popular realm, he is better known as the person who identified Joe Klein as the author of the political novel Primary Colors, and for his, I have to say, somewhat unfortunate involvement in the John Benet Ramsey murder case and in the investigation of Stephen Hatfill in connection with the anthrax case. As that's been a number of years, this was a guy who was, in the end, it was investigated by the FBI for at least a decade, but was eventually concluded to be a false trail in the anthrax poisonings of fall of 2001. Foster claims, and these, the use of these phrases, these short two and three word phrases, is referred to as statistically improbable patterns. You've probably seen this phrase, this item in Google, like when you Google, not Google, I'm sorry, Amazon. Amazon will identify books by statistically improbable phrases. This is one of the ways, if you're looking for a book about a general topic and you don't know a title, this is how they'll vector you to a book. His claim is that the phrases malign behavior, shared values, and first principle are common in Mattis's public statements, and that the last two phrases, tribalism trap and two-track presidency, are phrases that, of the possible suspects in terms of authors of this article, he thinks only Mattis would have ever come across. Tribalism trap comes from an extremely obscure 1987 paper on academic paper on disarmament, and two-track presidency is actually a Ralph Naderism that Mattis is thought to have come across when researching a possible third-party candidacy on his own behalf. All this is a great example of how most people think modern stylistic authorship attribution works, and it's wrong. This is not how we do it. The focus is not and should not be on unusual words. The focus, which are almost invariably what we call content words, and we'll get to that distinction in a minute. This is an approach that has an extremely poor track record, both in terms of academic work and in the popular realm as well. We do focus on most frequent words, especially function words. And by function words, I mean articles, prepositions, conjunctions. Content words would be things like nouns, verbs, adjectives. And adverbs fall somewhere in between. Short adverbs are particles, and they do count as function words. The point of this is the following, that function words tend to be very, very stable over long periods of time in language. People make up new words, new content words in a language all the time, but function words change very, very little, even over the span of centuries. And two, we don't think about them very much. can you go and get this? Writers and readers process function words on a subconscious level. Wait. This is probably less true of poetry. Those of you who are interested in poetry, maybe a little less true, but prose writers do not pay much attention to content words, and neither do their readers. Now Jordan is going to hit the button here, and we're going to flash up a text sample for you. And your challenge in the about 3 seconds we're going to leave it up is to count how many occurrences of the letter F you see. So, go. And that's probably enough. How many F's did you get? You got 3.
I got 3, but I only got through like 5 words.
How about you?
So.
You got 3? So what was? Got 3. Almost everybody gets 3. You want to go? You got to go put it back up here, and there's a reason for that. So finished files are the result of years of scientific study and combined with the experience of many years. And the answer is, people do not count the F's in the word of. You skip over it. Okay. So this is an interesting thing, and it gives us some basis or some justification for the belief that that people really don't pay much attention to these things. This approach, that's fine. You don't have to change the slides again until the very end.
That's really incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but this.
I saw the scientific, but I didn't see the.
Right. It's people. We don't think very much about these function words. We kind of glide over them and process their meaning without so much conscious thought. This approach of attributing authorship based on frequencies of function words has had a lot of success. The really famous case that put this on the map was Mosteller and Wallace in 1964, and these were people who were statisticians. They were not humanities scholars, but they were looking to find, I guess for lack of a better word, a neat stunt that was going to show off the potential of the computer in the non-numerical or non-financial realm. And what they did is, building on the work of a scholar named Douglas Adair, they identified President James Madison as the author of 11 disputed essays in the Federalist. This had been an outstanding problem for 150 years for a kind of interesting reason. I think everybody knows the story about Alexander Hamilton getting killed in a duel, right? Okay, I'm seeing nodding heads here. He doesn't seem to have been very optimistic about the outcome of the duel. He was pretty convinced he was going to be killed. And he was really concerned in the last few days that he get credit after he was dead for his contributions to the Federalist. He viewed this as one of the most important things he's done, and he wanted people remembering him after he was dead for this. And so he wrote a letter, memorandum of some kind, in which he identified which ones he'd written. Now, you could imagine if you were writing something like this on the theory that you were going to be dead in a few days, you might be less than accurate, and maybe that was the case. But Madison did not contradict him immediately. He don't speak ill of the dead. But about 20 years later, toward the end of the time Madison was president, a fellow, and I don't remember the guy's name, but he was a publisher, approached Madison about publishing all of the essays from the Federalist in one volume for the first time. They had not existed in that form up till then. And he asked Madison, which ones did you write? And there was this overlap of 11 that both Madison and Hamilton claimed. The bottom line is, of the disputed ones, Madison wrote them all. Adair had determined this by what we would consider traditional humanistic textual scholarship. But Mosteller and Wallace did the statistical analysis, analyzing 30, 70, and 90 function words, in which they verified Adair's findings in this regard. And this was considered a great test case because there was already an answer that people pretty much accepted that had been arrived at by other means, but here was this proof of a new technique done in the most modern IBM computer with punch cards that really re-verified this result in a way that gave people a lot of confidence about this. A more recent finding that maybe, I think, speak more to your generation. How many of you have heard about the detective novels written by J.K. Rowling under another name?
Oh, yeah.
You can't. Does this sound familiar? I guess after the Harry Potter thing, she wanted to write something without, I guess, the judgment that might attach to her own name and put it out there. And I forget the pseudonymous author's name, Robert something, but people quickly suspected this was her. And Patrick Juola of Duquesne University quickly identified the author of this book. Title of the book was The Casual Vacancy, as in fact having been written by J.K. Rowling, using a tool called JGAP, Java Graphical Authorship Attribution Program. This is not the one we use here at USD, but it's conceptually very similar to the one we use. And finally, in my own specialty is in medieval history, I would point out the work of Mike Kestemont in Belgium, who's done a lot of work with the letters of Hildegard of Bingen. And this is interesting, this is relevant to your case particularly in that collaborative authorship is key here, and that Hildegard had a number of people who assisted her in preparing the documents of, I guess for those who do, I should rewind. Hildegard of Bingen was a nun visionary mystic of the 12th century. She was the Reverend Mother of an abbey, and she suffered for her whole life from horrific migraine headaches, but these headaches were typically accompanied by religious visions, which she would then dictate to other people and record them. So, as I say, this group in Belgium has done some very interesting work on untangling the authorship of these visions, or the records of these visions. So, nuts and bolts, how does this really work? And in a minute, how do you actually keep track of 30, 70, or 90 variables? This is where we plunge into the math. And this is the focus of my own scholarly work. This book is called, it's commonly referred to as Gratian's Decretum, because the person who compiled it is commonly thought to have been a guy named Gratian. It was written, well, it was circulating by 1140. Exactly when it was written is argued about a little bit. It is in Latin. If you want to come up after the talk, you can take a look at it. But one of the things that you will immediately notice is that some of the text is in italics and some of it is in regular font. And this is because about 80% of the book is quoted material. Gratian is not claiming this as his own. He's taking excerpts from papal letters or various treatises by patristic figures. And he is putting this all together, and it's the first systematic treatment of canon law. It's the first university textbook in Western civilization. And he has these excerpts, and then about 20% of it is commentary, where he is explaining to you what the excerpts mean. And in particular, people in the 12th century were very concerned with the idea of reconciling differences. All of this material whether it's scriptural, whether it's from popes, whether it's from church councils. By definition, it's all holy, it's all inspired by God, and therefore it cannot disagree in any detail. And this is nonsense, because it manifestly, everything disagrees with everything else. And what he's trying to come up with is I guess a heuristic that will somehow convince you that no, all of the apparent differences are just that, they're only apparent. 20-odd years ago, Anders Winroth, who's a scholar at Yale, found out that like every good college textbook, there's a first edition and a second edition. And since that discovery 20 years ago, there's been this argument about, well, did the Grecian who compiled the first edition and wrote the commentary that's associated with the first edition, is that the same person as the one who compiled and wrote the commentary associated with the second version? We call those versions the first and second recension, or just up here, R1 and R2. Here is a simple example of how this kind of analysis works, in that we will take the most common word in the dicta or the sayings of Gratian, these first-person commentaries he makes on the text, is in. Means exactly what it means in English. And the second most common word is non, means not. So these are great examples of function words. We've got a preposition, and we have an adverb that's a particle. I guess you would call it these short adverbs that are like function words. And we can count the number of occurrences out of the total number of words. And so here we have the number of in out of how many words are in the first recension dicta, and you get a number. To make it all sort of comparing apples to apples, we count it by number per 1,000 words. And what we are able to get, and there's a lot of math here, but basically the idea is we're able to determine what the differences in the frequency of occurrence are by standard deviation, which is a normal statistical term for dealing with this kind of thing. And again, you don't have to follow all of this, but basically we have what we call a standard deviation of 1.85 words per 1,000 is the difference, it's a mathematical representation of the difference between the frequency of in the first and second recension. We can do the same thing with non. Where this is useful is we can create a graph representation of the ways in which the first recension and the second recension differ from each other. Because there's a minor mathematical gimmick that's going on here, that because I only have 2 samples, the standard deviations are all 1. In real work, we're not going to see that. That's just a weird artifact of this demo. And in a minute, Jordan is going to show you things where the numbers, you get real answers. But this is good enough for the demo. Now, I guess 3 things I would point out about this. 1, the origin of the graph is not where you think it is. It's not down here in this representation. It's where the dashed lines meet. And I'm doing this to be consistent with the tool that we're using. And at the end, we'll show you a real version of this with 49 words taken into account. Second thing I would point out is these graphs tend to treat the axes as if they're, I guess, uniform in size, right? Or that the units are uniform. But I would point out here the difference between the difference of 1 standard deviation here, and that's the units on the graph, is equal to 1.85 words per 1,000, whereas it's equal to 1.65 here. So things are a little, you ought to visually squash things down that way. Third, and most important, is Drawing it this way implies that these axes are actually perpendicular to each other, which they may or may not be, although it's mostly a matter of degree. They're certainly not perfectly perpendicular to each other. The question is that wildly misleading? We're going to introduce in a second a technique that gets rid of that uncertainty. But you do have a simple representation of the difference of these text samples based on some very common words. These are not, you know, this is 14% more. In occurs 14% more in the second recension than the first. Non occurs 15% more in the first recension than the second. These are not small differences, especially with such common words. These are not, it isn't a case of these are infrequent words where a small difference in the count can make a big difference in the percent. There's a lot of occurrences. Again, 1682 for in here, for example. Now, we're obviously not going to make an attribution of authorship just based on 2 words. Increasing the number of functional words we collect does increase the accuracy of the stylometric analysis, but only up to a point. Because as we go down the list of words in frequency order, each next word that we take has less significance to the analysis than the one before it. In general, with text, we expect the frequencies to fall off according to something called Zipf's law, ZIPF, which is an approximation that says that each, as you go down the list, let's say you have words 1, 2, 3, 4, that word 2 will appear half as frequently as the most frequent word, that word 3 will appear a third as frequently, word 4 will appear a quarter as frequently, etc. So you have this falling off. This is, as I say, this is an observed empirical relationship. It doesn't always work this way, and you'll notice you have nothing like that kind of falling off here in the first 2 words of Gratian's Decretum. But as you go down the list, you are getting, you're getting less frequency. I would also, go ahead.
Is it okay? Yeah, can we ask a question?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, how are those lists created? Like you said, like the frequency goes down as you go down the list.
Yeah.
How do you make the list?
Oh,
Like,
you
as it appears on the page, or is it?
Well, what you do is you literally, so you take an electronic copy of the text and you literally take it apart word for word, and then you count all the words that are the same. You would make sure, you don't, like for example, we don't make a distinction between upper and lower case, right? You lowercase everything, you find, and you just count every word in it.
Okay, so then the list is based on like how frequently the word shows up?
Exactly. Right. And you would normalize that, right? Because your text samples may be different lengths, and so you don't want to, you want to be comparing apples and apples, and that's why it's typical to normalize it as occurrences per 1,000 words. That could be, how you choose to do that is kind of arbitrary, but you do make sure that you're scaling it appropriately. Okay. The other point I would make is that as you go down the list of words by frequency, you're going to start out with, it's almost all going to be function words, but the further down the list you go, it gets to be more and more content words very, very rapidly. And so for example, for the first 20 words in that anonymous op-ed, it's 18 function words, and the first content word comes in at number 15, it's president, and the only other content word comes in at 18, and it's Trump. And so not surprisingly, given the content of the article. But as you go down the list, you get more and more and more, and by the time you're in the 40s, with that example, it's almost all content words. For the work I'm doing, which we'll show you a graph at the end with Gratian's Decretum, I try to get around 50 words. And I have to go 250 places down the list to get 50 words. You know, the first 20 or 30 are easy to get, and when you get past that, it gets really hard. Increasing the number of words also introduces a new problem. Because we were able to do this on a two-dimensional graph. Humans are really bad at visualizing anything more than 3 dimensions. We can do, Jordan's going to give you a 3-dimensional example in a minute, but our heads don't do real well with multiple dimensions. And for every one of these words that we are adding to this, we are creating another dimension. Who's had linear algebra? Okay. The world of linear algebra is not at all uncomfortable with arbitrary number of dimensions, and the techniques for dealing with this come out of that world. The particular technique that we use here is called principal component analysis, and fundamentally principal component analysis does 2 things. It looks for relationships between the frequencies of words in the samples. Let's say we were to find out that as the number of occurrences of in went up, the number of occurrences of non also went up accordingly. Those would no longer be independent variables that we could graph this way. So it looks for things where there's words that seem to go together. If this word appears, some other word always appears with it. If this word appears, some other word never appears with it. It varies inversely. And so it collapses these things down to a smaller number of vectors that sort of are in place of these word frequency vectors. And then it shows us just the first 2. So we can get our human comfortable 2-dimensional representation of this. Now we'll show you what does this look like when you've really done it. And what we have here is things that are in blue are the what I've referred to as the second recension dicta, the sayings of Gratian that are connected with his second edition of the text. The green is the sayings of Gratian that are connected with the first recension of the text, that first edition. And this material was the most interesting of all. This is something you might want to consider an outline. The book is it's a legal textbook, and it has 36 hypothetical cases that form the basis of his treatment of, I'll say, it's the middle section of the book, it's the biggest section of the book. And this is material that nobody ever questioned was written by the original Gratian, whoever we think Gratian is. And this was the really surprising finding that I had, is that no, the original, whoever we think Gratian is, did not write this stuff. And so the fact of this being out here and being so far away, and notice it's 6 standard deviations away on what we call primary component 1. So this is really clearly written by another author. So this is an example of when we go from kind of a simplistic version of this with just 2 variables to a fully worked example with a very carefully selected word list. We have 49 most frequent words, function words, and a really startling result, and 2, a result that is of considerable scholarly interest. And so I would say one of the things that's really great about this, these tools and techniques is not, I could explain this problem to the guy who edited that book in 1879. The statistical technique of principal component analysis has been around since 1905, but what the computer lets us do is experiment with these things in a very easy way. Somebody could have gone through by hand and gotten this result in 1905, but you would have spent years doing it, and nobody would have bothered doing it unless they were 100% certain that that result was there and they wanted to prove it. This has opened up an incredible realm for us to go just exploring in our data and see what's there, and it's frequently something that we never would have guessed. Okay, so I'm now going to hand it over to Jordan, who is taking on a particular project using these techniques as part of his participation in the Clack Fellowship this year.
So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the Tudor Plays project, which is a project that's been running at the school since about 2010, started by Dr. Giles-Watson, who unfortunately couldn't be here. But what we're doing in that project is we're in more than one way digitizing and modernizing the texts emerging from the Tudor period. Specifically what I do within the project is related to my Keck work, and that's working towards attributing an author to gentleness and nobility, which is one of those texts. It's first printed in 1525. And the significance of the problem is that the text emerges from the circle of Sir Thomas More, and these texts were of the first secular dramas that came from England. More specifically, the play, Gentleness and Nobility, that was written, it's a satirical drama about social class issues along with like economic issues. So it's still incredibly relevant today, and being that it's from the circle of Sir Thomas More, being able to attribute an author to that work could potentially be enlightening. If you're anything like me and authorship attribution is semi-new to you, you might wonder why you wouldn't just look in the title page to find out who wrote the play. And the reason you couldn't do that is because there's a frontispiece, which is just a portrait of John Heywood in the front of the book, which would lead you to believe that he had authored Gentleness and Nobility. But then there's a printer's colophon in the book that indicates that it may have been written by John Restell, who's the brother-in-law of Thomas More. So that in and of itself is very contradictory and raises questions as to who really wrote the text. And that's where I picked up, and I apply my knowledge as a CS major working under Mr. Evans to attribute an author to the work using this idea of principal component analysis. And this past weekend, what I did was I ran my first test of these ideas by finding the three most common function words in Gentleness and Nobility. And what I decided to do was, it was kind of tactful, was for my first text, I used the first half of Gentleness and Nobility, and for the second text, I used the second half. And the reason I wanted to do that was so that these 2 points would come somewhat closer together so that we can indicate that they're related. That's what that's supposed to demonstrate. Whereas my third text that I chose was from The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, so we knew that's not going to have anything to do with text 1 and 2. And that's what this distance is supposed to indicate to us. And well, I'll talk about the principal components that are being displayed on the graph first, actually. So principal component 1 is the variance in the frequency of the word I. The second is frequency of the, and the third is of. And these are the three most common function words in at least the first half of Gentleness and Nobility. So then when you compare the variance in the frequency of these words in the other text, you might get a graph something like this. This was all done by hand, so it doesn't look perhaps exactly how it should, but here's the PC1 is always going to be like your x-axis being that this is the largest variance. Out of all of these components, we see the largest change in how frequently I is used as opposed to the or of. In other words, of has the most comparable variance in, or smallest variance in frequency from text 1 through 3. And what's kind of interesting to note about this three-dimensional graph versus one that might be two-dimensional is that, and this is exciting for me because I also study math here at USD, so when you jump from that graph where you see here, you'd cluster these by drawing like big circles around them, and I mean there is math going on behind how you draw that circle. You don't just get to draw them wherever you want, but where I think this becomes exciting is these clusters would really be more like elliptical than they would be circles. So you get almost like these clouds of data. And this is useful because when you're dealing with authorship attribution work and you're using PCA, principal component analysis, to I guess derive this data into a more readable form, you can be working with, like in this example, I think you said it was 49 different function words, and that would imply that you might need 49 dimensions of data to make a display, which you can't do. So this is, I guess, nice, and I guess it adds like texture from the two-dimensional graph to the three-dimensional, but also, like Mr. Evans was saying, once you're moving further away from the most frequent function word, principal component 1, the word becomes less and less frequent according to Zipf's law. However, in examples that we've talked about where Zipf's law doesn't seem to take so quickly, where like the first few function words that are the most common are all comparable in occurrence, and that was especially true for like text 1 and text 2. I was used almost the exact same number of time per 1,000 words. So when that is the case, and PC1 to PC2 to PC3 almost have the same frequency in a few texts, having the third dimension of data, I think, probably adds quite a bit to your display. I guess something else that I'd like to mention about the project, the Tudor Place project, and my experience with it thus far has been using Python to actually be able to get to this point. So what I've spent a lot of time doing in the past year is learning how to actually prepare the text that we're using. So I didn't work directly with gentleness and nobility in preparing that for statistical analysis, but a large amount of time and work goes into first just like scrubbing the orthography of the text, and that's relevant when you're talking about 16th century plays where type kits had a limited number of letters to print each text. You get a lot of variance in the spelling, so that's kind of like the first place where you have to actually standardize the data that you're working with. It's not quite data yet, but first writing programs that are going to be able to standardize the spelling of all the words in your piece, and then again, I used Python programs to actually find out which words here are the most frequent. I think those things are all incredibly relevant, worth noting.
Okay. Well, I think we could open it up for questions maybe at this point.
You, on the first example on the article in the New York Times, you were saying that that expert you mentioned, he compared some words in your article with Jim Matey's speech.
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay to compare talking, because the way you talk may not be the same as you write?
I think for public figures like this, that is going to be a very hard attribution to make, and I'm going to say for two reasons. The article in the New York Times itself is only 965 words, and that's thin. Ideally, we'd like to have at least 3,000, although that's a little bit language dependent. For languages like Latin, you can maybe take it down to 1,000, but 965 in English is going to be tough. Second, it's going to be very hard. You have to have a good comparison text, and for somebody in the kind of public role that somebody like Mattis or Huntsman are, most of the text that we have from these people is by definition a collaborative authorship. They've had people on their staff work on it. It's the product of many hands, certainly their own among them, but not, by no means is it a personal text. Whereas I think we can reasonably assume that the piece as it appeared in the New York Times was just by merit of the person not wanting other people to know they were the author of it. Probably very few people saw it or participated in the drafting of it. So it's going to be fundamentally unlike the other texts attributed to that person that you're going to compare it with. Okay, it's like what Mattis goes up and says in front of the Armed Services Committee in a Senate hearing, his prepared statement, not very useful as a comparison text to this. Okay. Other.
So just tell me how to go about starting this, the Burke project. How would it start?
It would start with you getting a good electronic text of the items in this newspaper. All of the ones that well, no, I think we would want all of them to start with. We would then want to, you would then have to go through the process that Jordan described of making sure that the spelling was completely consistent between all the samples. You would then want to break them all up by these attributions, the letters like the B and the AE and the U, and see if those things actually corresponded to different authors, or if they're completely arbitrary. And so we're not saying who U is, we're not saying who B is, we're not saying who AE is, we're just saying, let's see if these are even different people. Or, and then, okay, let's see, you've got 3 clusters. Once you've been able to cluster these things successfully, then you would bring in pieces of, and in this case with Burke, you would want to have, since these are effectively writings from his college days, you'd want to have his earliest published work. You want to be as close in time as possible to that, and then see if those Burke samples map with any of the clusters that you hopefully already have at that point. And again, you would have to make sure that you were being consistent in terms of spelling between these other Burke samples you were bringing in and the ones from the paper. Interesting. In this example, I mean, there's no other writing attributed to this person in the 11th century. And all I can do is take a look at the samples internally here and say, are they all the same person or are they not? And I have one clear case where at least one of these things is clearly not the same person. And whether the blues and the greens are the same, this actually looks more like, 5 people, some of whom are overlapping, right? But it's an exercise in group authorship, and you have something here that explicitly claims to be an exercise in group authorship. So make that explicit, and then see if you can map one of those people, because you do have a candidate, to one of those clusters.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
So where exactly are you in the process of working with gentleness and nobility?
That's a good question. So I think that the majority of the time I've spent this year thus far working on the project has been orienting myself with things like principal component analysis and understanding first why they work before I'm actually applying them. And that in and of itself has been a lengthy process. And then actually going through the gentleness and nobility and finding the most frequent function words, that's been something that takes surprisingly long, considering that even the use of Python regularly like this for me is newer territory. So I think familiarizing myself with the practice of actually, analyzing the data, and also the process of retrieving the data from the text has been the majority of what I've been doing this year thus far.
Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all for attending. I hope that was informative.